so big! The mouse of the day is Ginormous George, and he is large and in charge, guys. I'm kind of scared, to be honest. Ginormous George was not hard to miss. In fact, it was nearly impossible to not notice him when he strolled through the village. With his towering height 3 times the size of the average mouse, George cast a long shadow wherever he went. His 2 tails, unusual and slightly mysterious, always swayed rhythmically behind him as he walked. What really caught everyone's eyes, though, was his ridiculous yet magnificent top hat. It was a gleaming, golden yellow, made entirely out of cheese with small Swiss holes that gave it a quirky and regal look. And if that wasn't enough, George wore a double tie. It was a combination between a bow tie and a regular tie. Despite his unusual appearance, George was loved by the whole entire mouse community. He wasn't just big, he had a big heart to match. Anytime there was a problem too large or too heavy for the regular mice to handle, George was always there. He could be found lifting heavy barrels of cheese, moving stacks of crates, and even fending off the occasional alley cat that wandered too close to the other village mice. But George never boasted about his strength. His kindness was quiet, and his help was always given without the expectation of praise. On this particular morning, George had been asked to help with a small but critical issue, the cheese festival. This year, the festival was expected to be the biggest one yet, and the preparations were well underway already. The village square had been transformed completely into a bustling hub of activity with stalls set up, decorations hung, and mice scurrying everywhere, just to make sure that everything was just right. As George made his way to the square, he noticed a group of mice gathered near the center, their whiskers twitching from worry. From the looks of their faces, something had gone terribly wrong. "George!" a voice called out as he approached. It was Peter, the mouse in charge of organizing the festival. Peter's normally calm demeanor had been replaced by frantic energy, and he was panicking, pacing back and forth, with his paws held together in worry. "What seems to be the problem?" George asked, his voice deep, steady, and reassuring as he stood by Peter's side. "It's a disaster," Peter squeaked, throwing his paws up in the air. "The centerpiece of the festival, the giant cheese wheel, it's fallen off the cart. It rolled down the hill and got stuck in the middle of the square, blocking the whole path. We've tried everything, but it's too big and heavy for us to move. If we don't get it out of the way, the whole festival will be ruined." George frowned thoughtfully, adjusting his tie-bow-tie hybrid. "Where's the wheel now?" Peter pointed toward the center of the square. Sure enough, there it was, a massive wheel of cheese, easily the size of a small house, or a large house even. Mice were gathered around it, pushing and pulling with all their might, but the cheese wheel just was not budging at all. George nodded. "I'll take care of it, Peter." The crowd of mice stepped aside as George made his way toward the cheese wheel. His 2 tails flicked behind him as he assessed the situation, and he crouched down to get a better grip on the massive wheel. His large paws dug into the side of the cheese wheel, and with a grunt and a little bit of elbow grease, he began to lift. At first, the cheese wheel didn't move at all. It was wedged very tightly between the stalls, and the weight of it was just immense. But George wasn't known as Ginormous George for nothing. With another heave, the cheese wheel began to shift. Slowly, it rolled free from its position, inching back onto the cobblestone path. The crowd gasped in awe as George continued to push the giant cheese wheel, rolling it away from the center of the square and into a safer spot near the bakery. Once the wheel was out of the way, George wiped the sweat from his brow and gave the crowd a small, humble smile. "Problem solved," he said, adjusting his cheesy top hat with a grin. The mice erupted into cheers, their tails flicking with excitement. Peter rushed over to George, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved the whole festival, George. We would have been stuck here all day without you." George tipped his hat modestly. "Just happy to help. Now let's make sure the rest of the festival goes off without a hitch." With the giant cheese wheel out of the way, the preparations for the cheese festival continued at full speed. George spent the rest of the day helping out wherever he could, moving crates of cheese, setting up tables, and even hanging a few extra decorations that were too high for other small mice to reach. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, the festival was finally ready. The air was thick with the scent of melted cheese and freshly baked bread, and the sound of cheerful chatter filled the square. Mice from all over had gathered for the celebration, and the atmosphere was just electric with excitement. George stood off to the side watching as the villagers enjoyed the fruits of their labor. He smiled to himself, glad that everything had come together so well. The festival was now in full swing, with stalls offering all kinds of cheesy delights. From sharp cheddar bites to gooey fondue, there were games, music, and laughter, and in the middle of it all was a giant cheese wheel, now serving as the grand centerpiece for the whole festival. As George admired the scene, a familiar voice called out to him. "George, over here!" George turned to see Floral Fiona, one of his closest friends, waving at him from her stall. Fiona was known for her flower garden, but today she had transformed her usual flower arrangements into elaborate cheese-themed bouquets. She wore a garland of tiny cheddar flowers around her neck, and her stall was decorated with cheese-themed floral arrangements that smelled both floral and faintly cheesy. George made his way over to her stall, tipping his hat as he approached. "Those look incredible, Fiona. You've really outdone yourself this time." Fiona beamed a smile back. "Thank you, George. Thought I'd try something a little bit different this year. Who knew cheese and flowers could go together so well?" George chuckled, admiring one of the bouquets made of edible cheese petals. You've certainly got a knack for creativity, Fiona. As they chatted, the evening grew darker and the soft glow of lanterns illuminated the village square. The cheese festival was reaching its peak and soon it would be time for the grand finale, the cheese parade. The parade was one of the most anticipated events of the whole festival, with mice marching through the square, showing off their most elaborate cheese creations and just doing some cheesy dances. Peter, who had been busy organizing the parade, suddenly rushed over to George, his eyes wide with worry. "George, I need your help again." "What's the matter now?" George asked, sensing the urgency in Peter's voice. "We can't get it into position," Peter said, holding his paws nervously. "We've tried pulling it with ropes, but it's not moving, and we're running out of time." George nodded, already heading toward the back of the square where the parade floats were being prepared. When he arrived, he saw the problem immediately. The main float for the parade was a massive cheese sculpture shaped like a mouse riding on a cheese wheel of brie. It was indeed enormous. Several mice were gathered around it, pulling on ropes and trying very aimlessly to get it into place. George cracked his knuckles and adjusted his hybrid tie. "All right, stand back, everyone. I've got this." The mice stepped aside as George got in position. His large paws gripped the back of the sculpture, and with a deep breath, he began to push. The float creaked and groaned as it slowly began to move, the wheels turning as George applied more and more pressure. The mice watched in awe as George single-handedly pushed the entire float into position, his two tails swaying behind him with every step. When the float was finally in place, the mice erupted into cheers once again with excitement. "You did it, George!" Peter exclaimed, rushing over to thank him. "We're ready for the parade!" George smiled wide and looked around to see all the happy faces of his fellow villager mice. Sure, it had been a long day, but seeing the festival come together like this made it all worth it. As the parade began with floats of cheese wheels, dancing mice, and colorful decorations, George took a step back to admire the scene. He wasn't usually one that liked the spotlight, but tonight he didn't mind taking a moment to bask in the joy that he helped create. As he stood there, his cheesy top hat gleaming in the lantern light, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in his own strength, but in the strength of the entire community around him. They had built something beautiful here. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new problems to solve, but for now, Ginormous George was content to just stand tall and watch the village he loved so much celebrate the one thing they all had in common, a shared love for cheese. And in that moment, Ginormous George knew everything was just right. Do you guys mess with Ginormous George?